This is a video about how to create and use functions in the command line interface to further automate your local environment setup and navigation. Aliases and chained aliases are great if what you're automating is always exactly the same. If, however, you need the logic to be a little more dynamic based on the presence of one, many, or no parameters, functions can be very useful. One use case I've found particularly useful is mixing an alias that you'd normally use for navigating to a folder with a dynamic parameter. It's arguable whether another explicit alias would suffice instead, but let me show you what I mean. I use QMK to flash different layouts on some of my keyboards. I have a Plank, HHKB2, and Helix keyboard that I'll sometimes edit or change the layouts of. There's the main QMK directory that I can CD into, and I have a general alias for that. This takes me into the top level of the QMK repository on my local machine. I could then create 3 explicit aliases for getting to the directories where the key maps are of each of the keyboards I talked about previously. Something like, this is adequate and gets the job done, but isn't scalable. The more different keyboards I need to navigate to, the more individual aliases I'd need. Rather, I can make a function that accepts one or no parameters. The use case of this function would be KB if I simply wanted to navigate to the QMK repository, or KB and a keyboard name if I wanted to go to that directory. We can take it a step further and have multiple parameters with validation for each. Let's say we want to build the layout for our keyboard. This build function has some basic validation with a conditional to ensure that 2 required parameters are present, but nothing fancy like type or value validation. If there are at least 2 parameters, attempt to execute the logic. In this case, navigating to the QMK repository and attempting to build the firmware to be flashed onto your keyboard, provided your parameter 1 and 2 are correct. Because these are functions you're making to speed up your workflow and to only be used by yourself, it's entirely up to you how strict you want to be with the validation, which may be helpful if they aren't functions you frequently use and constantly forget how to correctly invoke them. Another simple and useful function I found to help automate things that's not related to keyboards is making a function for NPM and all the other different scripts you might be using from your package.json. In a previous video, I had an alias is, which resolved to npm I and npm run serve, but it's hard-coded to that. With this function, I can instead do I can run things like ndev for npm run dev, and watch for npm run watch, or n-test::unit for npm run test::unit. Essentially, any script you define in your package.json, you can easily call with this without having to modify your function. This is just scratching the surface of what you can do, but hopefully it helps give you some ideas of some things you can tinker with to help automate your workflow, even if it is just by a little bit. Let's talk about the pros and cons. Pros, more powerful aliases. If I pass a parameter in, execute the logic this way, otherwise execute my already defined alias. Scalable functionality that would not be the case with aliases, which would need an explicit alias for each new additional case. The cons are going to be very similar to the gotchas that we experienced with aliases and chaining aliases, nesting functions or aliases too deeply that you need some detailed documentation on how to even use your own functions. Naming can get out of hand just like with aliases, so be mindful with that as best you can. And again, just like with aliases, forgetting the actual commands themselves once you're on a machine that doesn't have your functions or aliases defined there. Thanks for watching. In my next video, I'll be going over an often overlooked feature that iTerm offers that can help improve your dev workflow. Stay tuned for more.